Welcome Trinity Tigers. Welcome to Learning Together live webinar series as part of lifelong learning initiatives presented by Trinity University's Office of Alumni Relations. My name is Tiros Victoria Pisani, class of 2021, and I've been studying fashion for the past 6 years. It is my pleasure to introduce today's webinar speaker, Matt Swinney, class of 1998, founder of Austin Fashion Week, Fashion X Dallas, and Fashion X Houston. Celebrating its 10th anniversary, Austin Fashion Week is the 4th largest fashion week in the United States. Fashion X Dallas and Fashion X Houston are the largest fashion events in their respective cities. Fashion X puts its focus on hosting fashion events while giving designers and consumers the opportunity to connect directly through shows and pop-up shops. Today's webinar conversation will help you understand how the retail landscape has dramatically shifted and how that impacts independent fashion designers. Learn about how designers market and connect directly to consumers while cutting out wholesalers and retailers. Appreciate the value of high-quality apparel and how to accumulate quality over the quantity of fast fashion. I will have the great pleasure of engaging Matt in conversation on the subject. Please be aware you will be able to submit your questions as you listen to Matt, and he will be happy to answer them following or during our conversation together. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Matt and begin the conversation. First, let's start with a basic question. What's the purpose of a fashion show?
It's a good question in today's market. Really, it is about marketing now. You know, historically, fashion shows, New York Fashion Week, Paris Fashion Week, et cetera, had all focused on buyers, right? So it was an opportunity for each fashion house to set trends. You know, it's where Vogue would come in and take photographs and get very excited and publish what the upcoming trends are going to be. Now, certainly that's part of it, but that is not the primary crux of it. In fact, most of what you see from the major fashion houses on the runway will never actually make it into production. For many, many reasons, a lot having to do with the fast fashion side of it, that they're essentially knocked off the second they hit the runway anyway. So, you know, now it's really about how a brand can show who they are, what they're excited about, what they're inspired by, what their creative director is thinking, you know, and really use it as a 30-minute, you know, marketing commercial, essentially, right? Is what most of it is, at least with the major fashion houses. And for the smaller brands, it's more about connecting direct to consumer, which we're going to talk a lot about, and how to find that next buyer and their next investor or whoever to really show kind of what they're all about as a small brand.
Right. So how do the fashion houses demonstrate their unique brand image through the show?
Yeah, so I mean, that shows are the perfect way to do that, right? Again, it's more like a 30-minute commercial. So, you know, we've seen Louis Vuitton do, you know, really focus on their kind of history and travel, right, with trunks, and we've seen them in train stations and, you know, with porters, you know, carrying trunks but dressed in Louis Vuitton clothing. We see Chanel all the time, you know, do really cool brand stuff. You know, recently they did the one that, I think it's even in a tent, but it looks like they're literally outdoors in a park with like a, you know, dried leaf runway.
No, that was beautiful.
It was amazing, right? And so it's sort of now, you know, you really are seeing creative directors come in and say, you know, what inspired this collection, and then how do we build an entire scene around that? But you're talking about a multi-million-dollar show at that point, you know, and obviously, like, a lot of what we do is with smaller designers, and how do they do that without having a multi-million-dollar show, right?
Right. Yeah, I know. I find it really interesting about how, like, you'll see a show on the runway, but that image is also projected through, like, their media and their advertisements, like, you know, through their YouTube or through their Instagram pages now.
Right, exactly. There's an entire ad campaign and marketing campaign set up for that collection, you know, months in advance before that thing even hits the runway. And the second that, you know, that person walks into that tent, right, that's the very beginning of the launch of this super extensive ad campaign, is really what it is for those fashion houses.
Like, I know on, you know, Instagram, if you scroll back, and it takes a while, but if you really scroll back, you can see them marketing their products and their image, but kind of in more of a disorganized fashion. But then as social media becomes more and more, you can see now that they actually have an image that they're projecting just by looking at their page.
Yeah, right. When they were using Instagram as a photo filter, and that was all it was at the time, and no one knew that it was going to become this huge social media platform. Right, exactly. And you're right. And even smaller designers have that issue. Probably even our brand has that issue. You know, if you go back and look, right, we didn't know, certainly, I don't know, what, 5 years ago, you know, much less 10, what all of, you know, these various, one, you don't know which platforms are going to make it, at least back then. I feel like every week there's some new one that we're supposed to pay attention to, and you kind of have to wait and see until, you know, wait till every 20-year-old, you know, decides that they're going to adopt it, and then once it's adopted, then we're all in, right? But same thing, all those brands have a really difficult time trying to figure out, you know, how do we utilize Instagram versus Facebook versus Twitter versus, you know, fill in the blank, you know, are we using Snapchat anymore? Are we only going to use Instastory? You know, I mean, all of those things, because it all has to stick to being on brand, and the fashion show, the show itself, is kind of what kicks all that off. Yeah, and I think each social media platform kind of targets a different audience as well, like the users of Instagram versus users of Snapchat. Sure. Like Snapchat feels much faster, and Instagram's much more long-lasting. Sure. Yep. Yeah, and clearly Instagram is trying to kick Snapchat out of the market, right? Exactly. How do you think that fashion influencers, you know, through social media have impacted the fashion industry? That's a huge change, right? So especially with the major fashion houses, you know, when you're talking about New York, London, Paris, Milan, for those 4 fashion weeks, that's probably the biggest change, right? They used to be, you know, front row was filled with buyers, and certainly Anna Wintour and people like that. And Anna Wintour is still there. Are the buyers still there? A few, but not many. You know, was it Tommy Hilfiger a couple years ago who created literally like the social media pit, right? So it's all these fashion bloggers literally sitting front row, and the entire purpose of them being there is to be Snapchatting during the entire show, and that they have the best shots for Instagram, right? So it's a totally different world from that perspective. You know, it's funny, do they influence trends? I don't think they influence trends any more than anybody else does. But they do influence new brands, especially to millennials, right? So when, you know, smaller brands, you know, when Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen launched, right? I mean, they had such a strong following on social media that, I mean, frankly, they really only launched via social, you know, and they had celebrity behind them, and that certainly matters. But that's why a lot of celebrities now can create fashion lines, right? Is because they know that every fashion blogger out there is going to pick them up, where a more traditional media outlet like a Vogue or somebody like that is going to be much more critical of them from a design perspective. It doesn't mean it's not good, but they're not necessarily going to promote it just because it's a celebrity, where the fashion influencer and blogger likely will promote it just because it's a celebrity. Right, and I think especially for millennials, seeing fashion by fashion influencers and bloggers, like them portraying that, really makes it feel more accessible. Because instead of something that, you know, you see in the stores or online as very exclusive, it's starting to feel a little bit more like accessible. Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, the flip side of that is social media is brutal, right? Yes. So you're going to get a lot of feedback in a hurry. You know, when Kanye launched, I mean, it was a joke, right? Like from a social perspective, right? It was like, wait, you want me to spend how much on torn up sweatpants? Now, has it worked? I don't know. Certainly it's worked from a brand perspective. Has it worked from an actual money-making standpoint, from like building a brand? I don't know, because that's the thing. Like, you're counting on this kind of wild west of media. You know, you used to be able to, you know, you could go to a magazine editor, and a lot of magazine editors would say, I really don't like this, therefore I'm not going to say anything at all about it. It's the old all press is good press scenario, right? Like, if they're not talking about it, then it's a bad thing. In the fashion influencer world, you get immediate reaction, right? So if a fashion influencer literally posts a pair of $900 torn up sweatpants, you know, and with a little poll that's like yes or no, I mean, very quickly you get this yes or no, which has actually been a huge benefit to small designers. There's a designer from Austin who does kids wear, and she literally does all of her market research on Facebook through polls. So she will literally make 2 outfits, you know, very similar to one another, slightly different changes, and then, essentially which do you like better? And so every mom out there and she's got tens and tens of thousands of followers, right? So every mom out there can say, I like this one better. And so if she's got an 80-20 split, why would she go to market with something, all she did was spend some money on a sample, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm only gonna go to market on the one that got the 80% approval rate, right?
Yeah, I know that I found so many brands through social media,
right, exactly.
by, fashion influencers, but also these brands just reaching out.
Exactly, yep. Absolutely, and that's been a huge change, right? And especially with a lot of those brands, being able to monetize for the fashion bloggers, right? So now you're getting into this weird, am I a journalist? Not really, right? I'm just you're using the term influencer. Mm-hmm. That's true, but they're making money on that, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does change the game, right? So if I'm Anna Wintour at Vogue, I'm not getting paid, at least theoretically, I assume, I'm not getting paid, to write a favorable review of the, new Gucci collection, right? Where an Instagrammer likely is getting paid to write a favorable review of fill in the blank smaller designer.
It's definitely a little bit more of a relatively new career,
sure.
But I know that you see it on social media and almost looks easy because, they're photos, but, there's a lot of hard work put behind that.
Yeah, there's a lot of boyfriends taking those pictures, aren't there?
Yeah, I'd like to see the behind the scenes photos, of them trying to get the perfect angle.
That's right. It happens.
Okay, so back to fashion shows, besides location, are there any significant differences between the 4 major historical fashion shows?
Not a lot. Obviously the origin of country of the designer comes into play here, right? So a lot of American designers like to launch in New York, British designers like to launch in London, et cetera. And in most of those cases, they're not launching in multiple markets, right? Like you're not gonna have a Paul Smith, show in both London and in Milan. He's only gonna show in London. So it's really that. It's more of a regional preference, right? So, and the audiences are different, right? Italian designers in Italy, most Italians only wear Italian clothing, right? Like where, funny enough, America is probably the hodgepodge, right? Where our style is so eclectic and so different because it's kind of a melting pot of a country that comes from so many different, it's an immigrant-led country. So from that perspective, we are probably in some ways, some of the most forward-thinking from a fashion perspective because we don't, British design tends to be a bit more buttoned up, with the exception of a few, of Vivienne Westwood or somebody like that. But the French definitely lead the more avant-garde traditions. The Italians love their leather. All of those kinds. So everybody kind of lands in different categories. So you'll see that on the runway, right? Like they know who their audience is, and that's where they're going to kind of continue to gear to. Where the American designers tend to kind of take influence from everybody else, as opposed to this kind of American idea of style, because it really doesn't exist, right?
So what's your personal experience with hosting and creating fashion shows?
I get to do it basically every day of my life from a career perspective. I don't do the actual production. Fortunately, I have a great team for that. But for us, it's really about how do you take a New York level production, provide it in a smaller city, and give designers who can't afford a New York level production the same experience from a how does this look perspective, right? Because our entire goal is to make their brand look amazing. So that's really the goal with anything that we do, is how do we make it feel as though you were at a, and I hate to even say this, but at a New York Fashion Week show. Frankly, I think our shows are better than most of those. Maybe I'm biased, but I've also had designers tell us that. So from a production level, that's really the goal, though. Everyone has this ideal in their head of what it's supposed to look like. And for us, it's not only making it look like that, but then exceeding it.
So how do you find your designers?
They go through an application process for the most part. Now we have a lot of designers that we've worked with that are smaller emerging designers, or even some mid-sized designers that we reach out and ask them if they want to show collections, right? But usually it's an application process. So they can literally apply online for each city. They can show in multiple cities, or just pick the one that makes the most sense for them. And it's all over the map. We really are looking for a diverse show. So that is diversity in, is it menswear, is it women's wear, is it children's wear? Diversity in who the designers are these designers who have been in the business for 15 years, or is it somebody who's just starting their first collection, or is it even a student designer who is kind of exhibiting this amazing level of style? Diversity in, I will tell you, here in Texas, there's a huge number, and they are very overlooked, a huge number of young African American designers that most people do not know, especially coming out of Houston and Dallas. So we really are trying to kind of suss that out. And what does that look like? Because a lot of those designers are bringing some really interesting kind of streetwear meets suits, which you're seeing from some of the big fashion houses, but I think these are actually doing it better in a more unique way. So for us, it's almost like pull in all the applications, see who's there, see who's not there, and who we should be reaching out to that maybe we haven't found yet. And then sometimes it's just some impressive Google searches of trying to suss out some people that, either were too expensive or something like that. We still want to be able to see their work, even if we know that they can't show yet. Unfortunately, we have bills to pay too. So, the goal is to try to find that balance of how do you find someone who has the ability to show a collection from a financial perspective, and then how do you also find ways to scholarship some? Because you never know who's going to end up on that runway. And we've had multiple stories. We were talking about one earlier before we started. A guy, Mysterious by NPN from Houston, he reached out to us 4 or 5 years ago and literally only gave us sketches. He hadn't created a full collection yet, but what he showed us from a sketch perspective is amazing. It's a sketch, like who knows what this is going to look like, when this is all said and done. But we took a chance on him because his passion level was there. It was very clear that he had some really unique ideas. His family is back in Vietnam, and he now goes back, a couple times a year, and they build a collection there in Vietnam. So he's using Vietnamese textiles, he's using Vietnamese sewers, it feels very, very personal to him. And then it comes back and yet still shows perfectly on an American, even a Texan runway, right? Like you don't think of Vietnam and Texas, necessarily merging very well. And, that was one of those times that you just take a risk back then, and we've taken that risk with some others and it hasn't worked as well, but it's worth it to me. It's worth it to really have an opportunity to see if that next person is out there, and Nicholas from Mysterious has become one of the most prominent designers in Houston now.
That's really neat. And you were telling me earlier about the designer who was 11 when she started with you.
Yeah, so Isabella Rose Taylor started in Austin. I believe she was 11 when she showed her first collection with us. And it was kind of this very Tory Burch inspired resort collection, which is not even close to what she does anymore. But again, same thing. She has parents who were both in the medical field. I think they were sort of like, I don't know what to do with this sort of prodigy of a creative kid. And she's also like a Mensa member. She is just crazy, crazy smart, Isabella is. And she has now gone on, and we took a chance on that one, and she was a little girl literally walking behind those models, tiny, tiny and tall, tall, tall models, like the sweetest little thing walking out there, and now she's sold, 4 or 5 collections to Nordstrom, and she just did a big deal with Pottery Barn Teen where she had, 100 or 200, 300 SKUs with Pottery Barn Teen under her brand. So, I mean, there were like 20 pages in the catalog, that were all Isabella Rose Taylor for PB Teen. So it really is fantastic to watch because, again, you just don't know. Everybody that comes across our desk that we curate in and say yes to, they all have that potential. It's just a matter of who can. Some of it's pure dumb luck. Some of it is much like the music industry. The right person walks in the door at the right time, and and it isn't always about talent, though the talent is necessary. Oftentimes, there's just some of those people who are kind of biding their time and waiting for that right person to walk in the room.
That's incredible, and it's especially great that you are able to have that kind of avenue for these up-and-coming designers to feature their designs.
Yeah, and that's the hope, right? Is that we are hopefully the first right person to walk in the room, but then when they walk in and they show that collection in front of 700 or 800 people, that one of those 700 or 800 people is kind of the next right person to walk in the room at that moment.
Right. So circling back to fashion shows, are there any negative aspects to hosting one? Not
really, at the end of the day. I mean, it's exhausting, don't get me wrong, But at the end of the day, we get to walk away with this really amazing, set of photographs and memories that we get to create. And I think I remember almost every single runway show we've ever done. Eventually, we're going to put enough of these behind us that I'm not going to remember them. But I can still remember basically every designer. I can't always remember what year or what season they showed, but show me enough pictures and I will eventually remember. And that's the thing, right? You get to work with fashion designers and models and hairstylists and makeup artists and all these amazingly creative people every single day, and they keep it really inspiring.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly interesting. Like all the time, there's something new, someone new to meet, something new to see.
And the other part of it that I don't talk as much about is even on the sponsorship side. You have these. For it to work the way that we want to do it, where we're keeping costs down for the designer, you really have to have corporate partners come in, and it's really neat to work with brands that see that value, that really can say, fashion designers are important. They are important to the cultural fabric of fill-in-the-blank community. They are somebody that we want to, help nurture, and that's such a huge piece of it. And they're doing it obviously from their own brand perspective, but it's neat to see which brands are willing to kind of take that step.
So if you had to roughly try to remember, how many shows do you think you've worked on?
Oh gosh, so...
I know, I'm putting you on the spot here.
Like individual designers or total shows? Because,
do both.
Yeah, so total shows, let's see, we're 10 years in Austin, so, let's say average of 3 nights each. So, I mean, you've probably done, 40 or 50 shows in Austin, just nights, and then 5 years in Dallas, so, another 15 or so there, and then Houston, another 10 or so there, and then you're talking about, 8 or 10 or 12 designers per night. So
that's a lot of shows.
Hundreds, I mean,
wow.
Probably close to 1,000 at this point.
So it's definitely safe to say you know what you're talking about.
We have been around this block a couple of times.
It definitely sounds like it. So what does a fashion show specifically provide to consumers?
I think the way we do it, it provides it a different way than the big guys, right? So what does New York Fashion Week provide to consumers? Frankly, I don't think a whole lot. And I think you're seeing that, right? I mean, what it provides is cool content.
Yeah.
I definitely want to go watch YouTube videos afterwards, but does it give me any, unique buying decisions or anything like that? Not really. If I'm that buyer, if I'm that consumer who wants to, see who buys Gucci, I'm just going to go to Neiman Marcus and go buy it, right? I'm much more relying on my personal stylist there, in that shopping experience. For what we do, my hope is that we are really introducing the fashionable end consumer, or even the not fashionable, who maybe wants to dabble in it, right? We're introducing them to a designer that they can meet, that they can know, that they can really view something special on a runway. Like they know literally when that designer walks out, like that person probably made that. At a big fashion house, unlikely, right? The creative director is going to walk out. Did they have a huge hand in that collection? Of course, and I don't mean to diminish that at all, but they are not the person who, put needle to thread.
Right. So probably for the historical fashion show, it's a little bit more of continuing the
Correct.
brand image.
Exactly. And I think for us, it's really giving them an opportunity to see what the kind of forefront of emerging designers looks like, at least here in Texas, and then giving them that chance to meet and then buy direct from that designer.
Okay, so maybe for the more historical shows, that's a way of continuing it on, and what you're doing is kind of creating that brand image.
Exactly, and we're trying
working to create that.
Right, we're trying to help those young emerging designers get that platform, right? A lot of fashion designers today don't necessarily want to go sell a collection in Nordstrom. There's a lot of downside to that. There's also a lot of upside, but it's a huge risk. And for a lot of those designers today, they want to stay at home. They want to sew in their studio. They want to have a small team. They want to create, they're totally good with that. They want that opportunity to make small collections for boutiques or do literally direct to consumer. I want to make a dress for Tia Rose, and that's it, right? And giving that, and so that's what we're providing, is that opportunity to this much, much bigger market that they would have a hard time reaching otherwise, of people who I know, because they bought tickets to a show, are highly likely to be a real buyer.
Right. So you're a Trinity alumni.
I am.
So what advice would you give to someone who's studying currently at Trinity about going into the fashion industry? How did you get here? What path did you take?
Yeah, so you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. I mean, one, I think you've made a great choice. No offense to any fashion schools in particular, but we talked about if you have a degree from a more traditional university, and then you decide to go into fashion, great. You're not going to be, you can always go get a master's from FIT or FITM or Parsons or whatever. But you're not going to be held back by that, as opposed to going to a fashion school and then trying to switch careers. If you decide that you don't want to be in fashion, that's a really difficult career shift. You're probably going to have to go get a master's degree in something else just to kind of create that, kind of one-to-one relationship. For me, I have zero fashion background. I talk about this a lot in media interviews. I graduated from Trinity in 1998. I did what everybody back then used to do. I don't know, maybe y'all still do. I went into Big Five Consulting. I worked for Anderson Consulting, which became Accenture, out of the Houston office. And then from there, after a couple years, I went to a software company in San Francisco. The dot-com bubble burst. The writing was on the wall. I knew I was going to lose my job fairly soon. Moved back to Austin. Started a throwaway real estate magazine. I love the magazine business. I hated the real estate side. So flipped that into a lifestyle magazine called Rare in Austin that was much more kind of arts oriented. And that's when kind of the creative piece of my entrepreneurship started to take place. But I started my first company when I was 25. So, and I have not worked for anybody ever since then. So I have a unique and weird career path. I don't know what the entrepreneurship stuff at Trinity is like now.
It's really good. I can
That's
speak
great.
to it.
It did not exist in 1998. Like literally, that was not a path. And I'm glad it is now. I think that maybe we were doing some like 3-day startup stuff or some things like that, like in the late 90s, that I think a few friends of mine from Trinity are still coming back to do.
Yeah, they still focus on that too.
Yeah, and I think I still have, I think some people from my class still come back and do it. But I went into that entrepreneurship side, and it really was just bootstrapped, all of that stuff that you know about. And then as 2008 hit, publishing a magazine was no fun in a recession. But I had started a couple of events, and I love that side of it. And events are relatively recession-proof. People still go out. They still want to go out. They'll still buy tickets. All of those things don't really change. And especially in a market like Austin that is never hit as hard by a recession as a lot of cities are. I knew a lot of retailers, boutique owners, designers, things like that. And I looked at it as a business opportunity. I did not go into it with a fashion background. I went in and said, look, as a fashion design kind of group, you guys are all splintered, and what you need, the term I usually use is you need someone to hug you. And I mean that from create a pin around you and put you into a room together and see what happens. And that's really how it all started, was me just coming out and saying, I'm gonna be that person. I'm gonna run it from a business side. You don't have to worry about how I make money. All I'm gonna try to do is figure out how to give you a platform. And lo and behold, 10 years later, I now do have an interest in fashion, but at the time I didn't. I legitimately did not. I didn't know anything about it, and I would be the first person to tell you that I put a few people around me who did know about the business, but I took a lot of their advice.
And what was your major while you're here? What did you graduate with?
So back then, there were just concentrations on the business side. So it's a very long title. It's a Bachelor of Business Administration with concentrations in marketing and international business.
Wow.
There's a mouthful. I don't think that's what they said as I walked across the stage. But
might have been the whole time while you're walking across, start it and finish it.
They never actually got to my name. But
right. So why direct to consumer instead of traditional wholesale kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's just a change in the industry, right? So we're all watching big retail houses, drop like flies. And, with the advent of obviously the internet and major e-commerce solutions, right? So as a fashion designer, I can sell to wholesale where my margins are low and my risk is high. Or I can use a platform like Etsy or Amazon or 19th Amendment or somebody like that, and I can sell direct to consumer and my margins are high. The flip side is the misnomer is, yes, I have higher margins, but now I've got to spend more money on marketing, right? Because it's still the internet, you still got to be found. And that's the trick. So if you're a highly curated, very quality designer who somebody like a 19th Amendment will pick up, because that's kind of the hybrid, right? Like it's an online retailer, but it's kind of a consignment-based model. So you're only paying them on sales. You can keep those margins high, but you still got to be able to push some audience there. If you're just because you're making it and putting it out there doesn't mean anyone will find you.
Right. And then actually a follow-up on the previous question, how do you feel about these online fashion programs, you know, like Parsons Online? I know Polymoda in Italy, they offer a 6-week program that, you know, I can speak highly of, but how do you feel?
I mean, I think it's great. I don't know a ton about them. I know a few friends who have done it even at a very young age, like middle school level, who probably are like checking some box that says that they're older than they are, which is the upside, right? There are plenty of young girls, especially that I know, that are highly interested in fashion. Our daughter is one of them, and they are so hungry for that knowledge, and they're so smart. So putting them into those kind of online options when they're probably too young to really go to them, I think is a totally, I mean, that's a win for everybody, right? And if I'm Parsons or somebody like that, what do I care at the end of the day? So I think that's a huge win. I think it's a great opportunity for people maybe like yourself who are getting a business degree at a more traditional 4-year university. You can start doing some of those things, right? That only makes you smarter within your chosen field. Is it going to teach you how to sew? Probably not. But if you're not interested necessarily in the fashion design side,
Or the fashion business.
Right, the fashion business side, then it's great, right? I mean, it's going to give you at Trinity is going to give you your 4-year business degree or whatever degree you choose, computer science degree or anything else, where, you know, that's going to get it's almost like an extension course, right? Without having to wait till the summer to go. And opportunities that you guys have that I didn't, frankly. You know, if I wanted to go specialize in something, I was going to have to do it in the summer and physically go to a campus somewhere else to do it.
Yeah, I've thought it's really interesting how a lot of these schools are starting to offer shorter programs, either for professionals to take a little bit of time to focus in on something, or for maybe up-and-coming people in the industry to kind of have a quick immersion to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of the college experience in general, right? I mean, colleges have, it's changed, right? The idea of getting an associate's degree, going to the Art Institute or Parsons or something like that, it's not looked down upon, right? When at my age, like if you went to technical school, that was a dirty word, right? And today, 4-year college is not for everybody, and that stigma has been taken off. That technical school, you know, it's not a bad thing, right? And that's really what fashion programs are. I mean, it's more of a technical associate's degree program, and if you know you want to go become a fashion designer, I would still tell you should also go get some kind of business degree, but who am I to tell you that? Like, if you can figure that part out of it, then great, go get that and go on. You can always come back and do it the other way around. I think the way you are doing it, where you're getting a business degree first and then the fashion side of it, is probably the smarter way to do it. But there have been plenty of people, I mean, Bill Gates didn't graduate from college. So, I mean, you know, there are plenty of people out there who will tell you that, you know, it depends. Every kid is different.
Right. So before we proceed, we have a couple questions. So how long do you work with a client before the runway show takes place?
I assume the client is the designer in this case. So it depends. So typically, you know, the application process is, you know, over about 6 weeks before the show. And then somebody from our organization reaches out to them, you know, to try to figure out what their hair and makeup needs are. How many models do you need? You know, because we're casting all that. One of the ways we keep costs down is that we do everything as group shows. So you are sharing models with all 8 designers that are showing that night or something like that. But that's the difference between a $2,500, you know, production fee and a $50,000 or $100,000 production fee at a huge show where you have all creative control. So they do give up a little bit of creative control by doing it with somebody like us, but at the same time we try and do our best to give them as much as they want. So I don't know, 6 weeks or so, something like that.
Right. So a little bit back to the historical fashion shows and kind of the main cities. Is there an Asian city that's developing into a fashion headquarters like Paris, New York, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably several. I'm not an expert on that subject, but certainly Japanese fashion is huge. Tokyo is absolutely an influencer city from a fashion perspective.
And they're very distinct, too.
Yeah, that's the thing. And honestly, is there an Asian city? No, there's a ton of them that are really in, Seoul, Korean fashion, like all the K-pop world, is super influential in the fashion world. And you're seeing, I think there's a lot of relationship between probably French designers and especially Japanese designers, right? So there's a lot of that kind of, because it's so avant-garde, the French audience is really interested in some of the avant-garde stuff that's coming out of especially Japan, Korea, even China to some extent, and then vice versa, right? Because both of those kind of groups, and maybe some of it is also the French influence in a lot of parts of Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, those kinds of countries, that maybe that has something to do with it too. But I think all of those areas are really, because they're so avant-garde, like we as Americans often look at Japanese fashion, we're like, what in the world? But then like next thing you know, you're seeing it in streetwear in the U.S., right?
Especially in New York. Or influence.
Yeah, and especially on the West Coast, right? I mean, there's such a strong Asian influence on the West Coast that, especially, super creative cities, L.A., San Francisco, Seattle, places like that, you definitely see it.
Right. Yeah, I actually bought this top when I was in Tokyo from a boutique.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
So back to consumers and traditional wholesale. Why is this a popular choice with designers?
It can be highly risky to go do a big retail deal. So in retail, part of the problem with the old model is that, and I won't pick on any particular retailer, but typically if you're a young, smaller designer and a big retailer comes and says, we're going to place a $100,000 order with you, you get super excited, right? But what really happens as a young designer is you're probably going to have to get a line of credit, right? So you're going to go to a bank with that purchase order and say, I got a $100,000 order, but I can't afford to actually produce the collection without a loan. So you go get a line of credit at a bank based on that purchase order. That bank then gives you the money. You then go produce it in wherever it is that you decide to produce it, probably overseas. You ship all that back. You give it all to fill-in-the-blank retailer. They then sell it. You don't get paid by that retailer at that moment. You get paid as those items sell. And so if they keep marking it down, then you still only get your percentage of what they keep marking it down to. And what started as a $100,000 order all of a sudden becomes, well, we had to put this on sale for back to school, and we had to put this on sale for, Memorial Day and da-da-da-da-da. And then when it's all said and done, if 25% of the order is still left, they hand it back to you in a box. So you didn't get all your $100,000. Now you're in debt. You've got to go pay off that line of credit. And it's just a big giant mess because now you've got all of your product and it's sitting in your hands. Okay, well now what am I supposed to do with it? Like now I have to sell it in order to try to generate that. So the risk for a lot of designers is just too high. Now it can be the thing that totally elevates you into a whole new category if it works, but the risk is just, it's massive. So it's up to you, right? What's your level of risk? And you could say the same thing about the entrepreneurial designer who wants to sell direct to consumer too. Like that's a risky proposition as well. So weigh your risk, decide what's most important to you. And also, how much do you want to change, because that's the thing too. If Nordstrom places that order, then you've got to figure out how to then cost it at a way that you can still sell it where it makes money. So that may mean that you're going to have to lose this design detail and this design detail, and how many times are you having to kind of, compromise on your original design in order to make it work. There's nothing wrong with that, but just know that those are the risks involved, right? So that's why a lot of designers just choose to go direct to consumer, because they can create smaller collections at low risk. They can sell them to boutiques. They might make less money. They might make more money. Or in a lot of cases, they just want to work directly with a client and do a one-on-one custom piece.
Right. So for the next question, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but what do you find is different in the way millennials shop, and how does this alter the market?
Well, millennials shop online. We know that. There's plenty of data to back that up. So And then also the other thing that's about millennials that I think is probably at least most interesting to me is that my generation was all about accumulation, right? And baby boomers before me were all about accumulation, right? Because they came out of the Depression, right? And then baby boomers were born and their parents had nothing because they came out of the Depression. And so as they started making a bunch of money, in the US, they started accumulating wealth, right? Big houses, lots of cars, lots of clothes, everything, right? Because they were proving that they weren't their parents. And the same thing sort of happened in my generation. We were taught that accumulation is good. Your generation is being taught that you don't have to accumulate a lot. It's cool to have a tiny house that you can move around from lot to lot so that you can live lots of interesting places. Let's spend money on experiences. Let's travel. Let's do all of those things. Clothing falls into that same category. Clothing at the end of the day is mostly a luxury. There are plenty of countries in the world that will tell you that you don't need clothing hardly at all, right? So here, what I think you're starting to see is that millennials will look at quality over quantity. They will say, I would rather have 10 pieces that are special to me for whatever reason. They don't have necessarily be expensive, but I met this designer in this place and I wanted to buy it directly from them because I got to meet them and it was super special for me, rather than 30 pieces of $5 H&M t-shirts, right?
Right.
So you're seeing a lot of that shift too, and that's a great thing for emerging designers who are selling direct to consumer, because that's that one-on-one relationship. And you're seeing millennials be totally cool with, hey, I have a question, like, can I customize this? Like, could you add this? And if there's a real designer on the other end of that, chat session or whatever, they'll go, yeah, sure. And I don't even think it'll cost that much. Like, it'll maybe add like $4 or $5 to the cost or whatever, right? Because it's an actual conversation between two people just having a business transaction at the end of the day, right?
Right. And with fashion being the second largest polluter in the world, I think having a focus on quality more than quantity is a huge thing right now.
Yeah, and again, knowing where your clothes came from, right? That's a huge thing. I mean, when you're seeing national news stories about people wearing a Zara jacket and the inspection tag basically says, help, they're not paying me, right? I mean, that, especially for millennials, right? You guys are much more attuned to that kind of thing and are very willing to say, well, why would I ever buy from Zara if that's what's happening?
Yeah.
Like, I am okay spending a little bit more money and knowing where that came from.
Right. So what advantages do major platforms, and we did talk a little bit about this earlier, like Amazon, Etsy, and 19th Amendment offer?
They offer bigger platforms, right? So it's kind of, to me, it's kind of the halfway between the brick and mortar retailers and just selling direct, say through your own website or social media. So it's the way where, obviously Amazon is the big giant beast, but Amazon is still figuring out what its fashion play is, and it very clearly is going to have a legitimate fashion play. Like, I think that they've made that very clear. Etsy is on the sidelines a little bit because it's sort of the crafter, so can you do high fashion or anything like that through Etsy? Some have and have been able to.
Or get their beginnings through.
Right, and so you've got, and then 19th Amendment is on the more kind of high fashion side. And so what they're essentially shopping malls online for, the ability for an emerging designer to get in cheaply, right? I don't have to know anything about how to build a website. I don't really even have to market it all that much. Like, I can just put myself out there and then just market the link to my specific store. And I think that that's kind of the advantage. You may give up a little bit of margin in it, but at the end of the day, like, it may be worth it.
Right. So we've got two more questions. One is about fashion week. So going to a fashion week can be really expensive for designers, travel, registration, etc. How do you help designers that show in Austin Fashion Week make actual sales after the event has ended? How much in sales do designers in Austin Week actually generate?
It's a good question. I don't know the full answer to how much they actually generate in sales. It depends on the designer, right? So for us, yes, the costs can be expensive in the grand scheme of things. But in comparison to most others, it's not. That's the thing, right? So going to fashion weeks, yes, can be expensive. Travel, well, if you want to do a show, let me put it this way. If I'm an independent designer, your options, if you want to do shows, and there are some designers who do not want to do shows at all, but if you do want to do shows, you have a few options. You can You can go to New York Fashion Week, do the big gun one, which means you're going to take out a loan to do it, most likely. Right. To get into any show that's going to have any kind of press coverage around it, you're looking at probably $100,000 to $250,000 spend. Not likely for most young designers. You have shows like ours, where you're going to spend a $2,500 participation fee, but all of your production side is covered. Yes, you're probably going to have some travel expenses off of that, but hopefully not too much to get to Austin, Dallas, or Houston, depending on where you're coming from. And that's really it, right? So to me, that's 1% of what you were going to pay somewhere in something like New York. Or the third one is you can produce your own show yourself in your own city. Well, now you're paying for models, hair, makeup, staging, lighting, all of that. Some people will come back and say, yeah, but I can get all that donated in for free. Okay, fine. And if that's the case, go do that. Is it going to look like a professional runway? Is it not? I don't know. Maybe you can do that. And if you can, then I would absolutely encourage you to go do that. But if you can't, then what's the in between? So how do we offset it? We offset it with the group shows. Frankly, it's funny, people ask all the time, they're like, $2,500 is kind of a lot. Like, we lose money on that. Like, we actually pay models. Like, these are not volunteer models. Like, that's not something that we do. These are professionals who are walking on the runway. We bring in professional hair and makeup teams. We bring in professional lighting company, things like that. So that's the trick, right, is how do you do that? And then the second part of the question was around sales. So to me, and what do we do to help them? So to me, my job is get everyone in the room. Your job is to sell them something. And that sometimes is a hard conversation to have with a designer. I can't wave a magic wand and say, well, you put it down the runway, and if nobody bought anything, like, that's on us. Like, I put 800 people in the room, all of whom were buying from other people. And if you're not selling anything, I don't know what to tell you. Like, at some point, a designer, it's a cutthroat industry, right? So at some point, they have to look in the mirror and say, here is my plan for selling. Now, that said, we are playing with some technology. We're playing with some options. There have been a lot of people who have tried selling direct from runway through kind of texting systems and things like that have not been very successful. We even have tried that, and it has not been very successful because, frankly, what happens is if I need to be texting, to the designer, I'm interested in look 3, direct from runway, people don't do it because they get engrossed in the show, right? Which is what you want. So there are some technology things that we are looking at to try to develop some things that would help that process. But as a designer, at the end of the day, you have to own some of that. You have to be able to come in and say, all right, we got the audience, we got the media coverage. And the way I always look at it is always leverage it into something else. So you got good media coverage out of it. You got your name out there. You got lots of social media coverage out of it. You got this deck of amazing imagery out of it and some video out of it. Now leverage that into something else, because that was clearly worth your $2,500 right there. So that alone, even if you didn't make a sale, you should be able to move that into sales.
Right. Okay. So back to fashion weeks. How do fashion weeks come into play with platforms like Amazon, Etsy, 19th Amendment? They
don't a whole lot, to be honest. And I think that's a miss. And when I talk about some technologies that we're looking at, some of it has to do with that. So how do you connect, this emerging designer who just walked on the runway or who just put a collection down the runway, can that person leverage it into, immediate sales through a platform like 19th Amendment? That should be available. It's not currently. That's the kind of technology that we're looking at, though.
Right. What are regional fashion weeks, and how do they differ from the historical ones? We did pretty much cover that. Is there anything else you want to add on that?
Not really. I mean, I think the regional ones are interesting because each, and that's the reason we have stuck to them, is that you can have local designers who can really be the linchpins to help sell tickets and get people in the room that are really interested, but then they discover all of these out-of-town designers while they're there. And that's where the out-of-towners kind of come into play, right? So you're getting the discovery in a city that maybe you're trying to launch, like a Houston that has a huge market and a huge opportunity and fashion love everywhere.
Right. So this is going to be our last question that I have. So if you have any questions for Matt, this is a really good time to send them in. So finally, what do you think is next for the fashion industry? What do you see changing and evolving within, the next few years, 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really on this business side, right? Like it's really how are designers going to navigate a world where brick and mortar retail is not your primary kind of channel to get through, right? And what's going to happen? Because to me, what I'm seeing is that you've got sort of two sides of the brick and mortar retail side that are still working. And that is the very, very inexpensive H&M Zara model, fast fashion model, and then the very high-end luxury Bergdorf's Neiman's model. And everything in between is kind of a giant mess, right? So, because all that in between is basically just, it's more expensive than H&M or Zara, and it's about the same quality. So what's the upside? Why would I buy something at middling retailer that has been mass produced overly so when I could buy if I'm going to buy mass produced, I should just buy it for cheaper over there, right? So that group, in my mind, over the next couple of decades will eventually go away. Because there's going to be no reason for it. There isn't going to be a consumer base for it. I think the luxury retailers will still be there because people will always love those big fashion houses, and they will always have exclusive agreements at places like Neiman Marcus, and that's great. And then I think you will have the H&M Zaras of the world that I can kind of speak poorly of as much as I want to, but at the same time, they're here to stay. They're gonna, unless millennials and the generation even after you come in and say, we're unwilling to buy this because we don't trust the business practices behind it, which you're gonna need billions of people to basically stand up and say that, then it's always gonna be there. So to me, if you are a designer who lands in that kind of middle category, that's what you're going to have to figure out how to navigate. Is how do I do that without, the low end of the market and the high end of the market? And I'll be curious. The one that I want to watch is Amazon, because they clearly have set themselves up as the monster in the retail business, and they haven't really even scratched the surface in fashion yet.
Yeah, although they are starting to try to. They have their own label, and they're starting to carry other designers.
Right, and yes, they're starting that, but I mean, they are really just on the front edge of that. And it's funny that they use so much of the Alexa technology around fashion early on, right? Like we saw it, like there's the closet one, there's the video one, I mean, there are all kinds of things that are getting tied in. And then just how technology plays into it, right? Like I saw a South by Southwest panel a couple years ago, and person talking about like, look, our technology is there today where you should be able to wake up in the morning, your Google Calendar is tied into whoever else's Google Calendars, right? It knows who you're meeting today. If you live in New York, like, hey, Tia Rose, let's put on a sensible shoe today because you're going to have to walk 6 blocks from this meeting to this meeting, and your 2 o'clock meeting is already wearing red, so let's not wear red, let's wear this, and while you're in the shower, I'm going to go ahead and print out your shoes for you. Like, I mean, all that technology is here now. So the idea, or it's going to be a little rainy, so like make sure you take your raincoat. All of those things and how they tie to what you get dressed, what you put on in the morning, it's all there. So I will be curious how probably companies like Amazon, all of these cool little apps that are coming out, like how they all start to speak to each other and how that will ultimately affect purchase decisions.
Yeah. I mean, even now you can ask Alexa, what should I wear? And she's like, oh, it's kind of cold outside.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay.
Yeah, but in this case, like your Alexa should know literally everything in your closet, right?
Yeah. That'll be great, honestly, if she could document that.
Right.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left, and the questions are coming in. So
it's kind of exciting when people actually ask questions.
I know. I've been watching them come in. I'm like, wow, okay. So this one asked a few minutes ago, but I saved it to the end. So what are some fashion designer accelerator programs do you recommend?
I'm not an expert on this subject. I'll be the first to admit. Actually, interestingly, the City of Austin just launched through Austin Community College a new incubator program that I think is going to be really cool. It's all around technology and fashion. They have a new deal with Gerber Technologies that just put like, a couple $1 million worth of equipment inside, if you're from Austin, the old Highland Mall. And it's a really, really unique facility that literally just launched like within the last few months. So I'll be very curious how that one looks. I do know that specifically uses the word accelerator. I don't know the accelerators as well as I know some of the incubators. We have 2 designers from Dallas that we work with a lot that I think you're either finishing up or pretty close to being done with the St. Louis Fashion Incubator, which I've heard is wonderful. And then I know there's a really great one in Brooklyn as well.
Can general community members attend your shows?
Yes, so that is one of the things. So the fashion industry has been super exclusive for so long that that was one of the things we wanted to change. We really wanted it to be it's not about registering, it's not about proving that you're a buyer, a member of the media, or an influencer or anything. If you want to buy a ticket, you can come. There are also press credentials and things like that we offer, but if you want to buy a ticket, you can come at the end of the day.
So, in many countries in the world, you bring fabric to a tailor to have clothes made to fit your figure. There are a few online companies that allow you to upload your dimensions and pick fabric. Will this type of clothing become a bigger shipping style in the US?
Yeah, I think so. I think I said earlier that I went to Pakistan last November, and that's how most clothing is made there. So you buy textiles and then you take it to a tailor and have it made for you. Funny enough, even in Pakistan, one thing that was new to me, that concept was not new to me, but one thing that was being inside a retail shop, which is usually designer driven. So it's a designer who owns the retail shop. And there were some that literally had boxes of fabric. So you would buy, like, here's the look, and it's a picture of a model in the look, and then the box of fabric with it all pre-cut, just bigger than it needed to be, so that then you could take it to a tailor and have it finished. And these are in luxury level retail stores. It's a totally different concept. We do not have that, as far as I know, in the US. So, and when we bring some of these designers over from Pakistan, I've specifically asked them to bring some of that because I think a Western audience is not used to that. At least not an American Western audience is not used to that. So the answer is yes. I do believe that will become more prevalent in women's wear. It's always been prevalent in menswear. So tons of people this is a custom jacket, so, and didn't necessarily cost any more than buying off the rack. So from a menswear perspective, we've for decades gone into a tailor, said, pick out my fabric, measure me, go on.
Especially because it's so fitted that you almost need to do that for a good fitting suit.
Exactly. Now, how all the online apps will work with that, frankly, I think the technology has to get better, right? I mean, this whole lean your phone against a thing and stand and spin and all of that, we'll see how that goes, but over the next 5 years or something, that technology will get better.
Maybe in the future, Alexa will scan you and tell you what to wear, tell your measurements.
Exactly.
Okay, so thus far, this is our last question. So if you have any other questions for Matt, this is definitely the time to send them in. So do you think designers would ever use eBay?
Sure. Yeah, why not? eBay, I have not mentioned it here, but it lands in the same category as the other ones. The concept, though, of using eBay as it was intended, as an auction platform instead of a buy it now platform for designer level clothing is interesting. And if I were a designer, I would play with that, right? So I custom made this, or I made this sample, look, something is only worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it. So, you may know what your cost is, and especially as a marketing research tool, something like eBay would be fantastic, especially if you have a large following, to be able to go in and say, bid this thing up. This is a one-of-a-kind piece. Bid it up. Let me know what you think it's worth, and then I'll decide if I want to go to production on it. Right? I think it's really interesting.
Okay, we've got some more questions. 3 minutes left. So, to what extent is eyewear prescription part of the fashion industry, and are you familiar with any relevant retail trends in that area?
I'm not super familiar with it. We have had eyewear sponsors for our events, and I love eyewear personally. I will wear glasses actually fairly often, especially for events. Eyewear as an accessory is very clearly a trend right now.
Some of them are clear and everything.
Yeah, super cool. And there's a bunch of really amazing, there's a couple retail shops in Austin at least that have opened that really focus on small batch eyewear designers. I saw one eyewear designer who's literally taking old records, vinyl records, and they're
Really?
like cutting, and like essentially super gluing them all together. I mean, like this amazing, like, these cutouts and die cuts of eyewear. So, I mean, whether you wear glasses or not, funny enough, like everyone gets LASIK now. So like you don't actually need glasses anymore until you get old. But then, then we're coming right back to it as an accessory. So
That'd be really interesting for a fashion show, like
Yeah.
how much can you do for the glasses?
Right.
Are you involved in Fashion Week San Antonio?
We're not, and honestly, I know very little about it. I will tell you that we have been approached by multiple organizations about doing something here in San Antonio, and it's on the list. We'll see.
Okay, well then I think that's all. Anything else you wanted to add before we conclude?
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. So thank you so much for attending this live webinar, and a big thank you to Matt for joining us today. The next webinar is scheduled for June 28th at noon Central Time, featuring Coach Jim Potter, class of 1963-1967, and former director of Trinity's intramural program. He will bring back Trinity athletic memories. Tune in then to hear him discuss this topic. Bye, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.